have, there we go, thank you. Exactly what I was gonna do. Nope, we lost somebody.
Okay, so should I just go ahead and get started?
Yeah, so if everybody wants to switch over to speaker view.
Awesome. All right. So hi everyone. My name is Isabel, and I do a number of things in the end of life space. I'm a volunteer with the Funeral Consumers Alliance of Pennsylvania. I'm the vice president of the National Home Funeral Alliance. I do some work with the Green Burial Council, and there's actually a new green burial organization that was started by my friend Karen Bonificino for Pennsylvania, specifically called Friends of Green Burial PA. So those are all of the organizations that I'm associated with. But today we're just going to be talking about the green burial piece. And so just to, have some context, I really enjoy having very interactive presentations. So if at any point anyone has questions, feel free to just jump in. I don't mind that at all. No need to save your questions for the end of the presentation. I'm just going to do basically, I have some slides to share, and then we'll just open up for like a more back and forth Q&A period. So does anyone have any initial questions on that or anything, or I can just dive in? Cool. So let me know if you can see my screen. We're good? Okay, cool. I'm seeing a thumbs up. All right. So for those of you who are completely unfamiliar with the concept of green burial, I'll just do a really quick intro or a primer to what green burial means. So basically, green burial is essentially the kind of burial that humans have been practicing for millennia before the funeral industry became much more industrialized and commercialized. Essentially what it is just placing a human, no casket, no embalming, no vault, into the ground. So you can do this at a green burial ground or a green cemetery. And there's some cemeteries, as we'll go into, that are sort of hybrid. And so they basically will be traditional burial grounds or cemeteries that have a green burial section in them. So just to outline some of the major differences, basically traditional burial, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the ins and outs of what a traditional burial might look like, basically in a traditional burial, you'll have a hardwood or metal casket that is buried about 5 to 6 feet underground in a concrete liner or a burial vault. And essentially that's kind of like putting like a casket for the casket. And essentially what that is it's kind of like when you look at a traditional cemetery, it looks very flat, and underneath is basically like a parking lot. And the reason for that is just because they try to keep the cemetery aesthetically pleasing. And when you bury someone, typically as the decomposition process goes on, you might see some like erosion of the soil, and so the liner is typically there to sort of prevent like divots and make it easier to mow the lawn, basically. And then you'll often see like a stone headstone as well. So just to give you some quick facts about the environmental impacts and factors around traditional burial. The average traditional burial emits around 250 pounds of carbon dioxide, and I know it's hard to like put that in context, so I'll have a slide later on that talks about like how that compares to other disposition methods. It also uses, typically if you're doing a viewing, it will use embalming fluids such as formaldehyde. And the reason why this is not considered very green is because that can cause embalmers to have higher rates of leukemia. It's actually one of the FDA's top 10 carcinogenic chemicals that is like basically available sort of commercially in the United States. So not only does that produce leukemia in embalmers, it also produces, like, I believe 3 times higher rates of autoimmune diseases among embalmers as well. So being a funeral director or someone who embalms is a very unhealthy trade to practice. And people also worry about all of that formaldehyde getting buried and going into the groundwater. Obviously, if you have a liner, that could mitigate that a little bit, but it's still leaching into the soil in a lot of cases. Um, and I mentioned the liner. Another factor that might be a little bit less relevant to this crowd, but many religions such as Judaism and Islam also require contact with the earth when being buried. So often a green burial is more like the Mennonites call it, a traditional Mennonite burial as opposed to a green burial. So compare that to a green burial. What you will typically see is, instead of a headstone, you might see a more like a native rock or a plaque, or potentially not even any sort of marker. If you don't want to have one, you might just track where the person was buried via GPS coordinates or like other tracking systems. Typically, you're buried, instead of being buried in either a metal or hardwood casket, the idea behind a green burial is that you want to make it as easy as possible to decompose. So often people just use a shroud that's biodegradable, or they'll use casket materials that are biodegradable as well. So willow is a common one, seagrass, things like that are all materials that are used in green burial caskets. And typically it's a little bit shallower. It's usually around 3 to 4 feet underground. And the reason for that is because typically that allows for, because the whole idea behind green burial is that, like, you know, you're trying to go back into the earth and like decompose into the soil. The ideal depth to be buried is 3 to 4 feet, because that allows oxygen flow, and you really need that oxygen to speed up the decomposition process. Now, you don't want it to be too shallow, because there's also this thing called the smell barrier, where you don't want animals to sort of like, you know, be digging up the grave. So that's why it typically happens about 3 to 4 feet. So when you're using this process, usually a body will decompose in about 2 years. So the idea is also that you're not necessarily getting a plot for life. You're getting a plot that can be reused in 2 to 3 years. And so that also minimizes that land usage in the green burial case as well. So as opposed to using carbon, green burial, and a lot of studies show that they sequester about 25 pounds of carbon dioxide. And also not having a casket sort of allows the decomposition process to happen sort of more naturally. A lot of these hardwood and metal caskets, the presumption is that they're like hermetically sealed, and they don't let any sort of like anything flow in or out. So that also doesn't allow a lot of those really useful microorganisms that like are used in any sort of like composting process that you might be more familiar with, you know, with your fruits and vegetables. All of those same microorganisms are at work to break down a body. And those do not provide any sort of risk to the contamination of groundwater. It's all like a natural organic process. So the main reason why a lot of people would choose a green burial as opposed to the traditional burial is because of the benefits to the environment. So to demonstrate sort of what those environmental impacts are, I use this exercise where I compare these two infographics. So these infographics were created by this blog called Talk Death. And on the left, they have, this is sort of the original infographic that they created, I think back in 2015. And then last year, they actually made an updated version of this with updated numbers. So I actually like to show both of them so that you can see a comparison of how, not only what are the actual, you know, numbers in terms of like, for example, acres of land, but how is that actually changing over time? How has that changed in like 6 years, basically, since like the beginning when this infographic was first made? And how might some of this like these trends be going up and potentially also going down? So it's not perfect like one-to-one comparison, but basically in the US, the cemeteries will, in 2015, they were taking up about 1 million acres of land. And now, or at least as of 2021, it has gone up to 1.4 million acres of land. So in the grand scheme of things, that's a lot of acres. So every year, and this is something they added in the updated version, it requires 1,600 additional acres of land for like the new demand for cemetery plots. And then it has this section on the embalming fluid. So this is probably the most drastic change since from the first infographic to the second one. In the beginning, in 2015, it was over 800,000 gallons of formaldehyde. And that number has increased dramatically to 4 million gallons of formaldehyde. And so this was enough to fill 1.2 Olympic swimming pools. Now it's more than 6 swimming pools every year. And then in terms of the actual materials used, in 2015, it was 115 million tons of casket steel. This one actually seems to have gone down, and I'm not sure if that's a typo. I actually wrote into them about that. But they talk about that they have different comparisons now in terms of how much, to give you a sense of how much steel that is. But that's over 2,000 Empire State Buildings, all the high rises in Tokyo. And in this case, it's, if you were to pave in terms of the millions of tons of concrete, that's basically like if you were to pave an interstate between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore every year. So that's sort of like the concrete comparison. So now in terms of casket wood, and often, and they point out here, that is wood that could come from the Amazon, often places that have tropical or precious woods. So the casket wood is equivalent to 4 million acres of forest. And here they chose a little bit different of a comparison. They just chose to talk about it in terms of board feet. So that's 150 million board feet of hardwood, or 1.14 times the circumference of the earth. And so that is sort of a sense of how much wood is being used. The infographic from 2015 shows that is basically 4.6 million single family homes, or over a third of all the homes in Canada. And in terms of the concrete that is used basically in those liners that I was talking about, it has gone from basically a swimming pool for all of those houses in Canada, which is about 4.6 million, to 100,000 swimming pools. And so let me just give a quick note before I talk about the cremation piece. The differences in why green burial is a better option in terms of the environment compared to traditional burial is very different from why it's better than cremation. So in the case of cremation, you're really talking about burning fossil fuels. And in the case of traditional burial, you're talking about uses of materials basically, and poisoning groundwater. So it's a little bit apples to oranges. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to think for yourself and do this comparison for yourself of what you want your environmental impact to be, is that it's a little bit difficult to compare if you were trying to look at cremation versus something like green burial versus traditional burial, because you're looking at different factors. But basically, cremation is really fossil fuel intensive. This isn't on the infographic, but to give you a sense, the typical, and obviously people's body sizes range drastically, but the typical or average amount of time that they use to cremate someone is about 4 to 6 hours, and the temperature that they're cremating you at is about 1,500 to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's very hot. And so that uses about 534.6 pounds of carbon dioxide that's produced from cremation. And it also emits other emissions like carbon monoxide, mercury, nitrogen oxides, etc. And so another thing to worry about with respect to cremation is these heavy metals that are going into the atmosphere and sort of polluting the environment. And that is basically enough fossil fuels to, in 2015, it was to drive you halfway to the sun. And now it is driving to the sun 5 times. So that has gone up basically 10 times because cremation, I believe in about 2016 was when cremation surpassed burial in terms of the most popular disposition method that people in America were using. So cremation has gone up dramatically, and that's mainly because cremation is almost always the cheaper option. Most, especially countries that are landlocked, like England and Japan, like they are basically at like 99.9% cremation. Almost everyone is cremating. So that is generally the trend in sort of more developed countries, is towards cremation. So, and we don't have to go into this because this is basically what this is about, but basically green burial is sort of the answer to both this problem with the fossil fuel emissions from the cremation, as well as the huge amount of resources that are being used in a traditional burial. So just to give more of a comparison of the actual, if you're trying in terms of like trying to make it a little bit more of an apples to apples comparison, just looking at the pounds of carbon dioxide that is used. And so for example, the way that you come up with this number with respect to traditional burial is basically by looking at all of the costs of emissions that is produced by making all of those materials, like making the casket, making the liner, that kind of thing, and digging the grave, basically, like often people will use machines for that. So for traditional burial, it's about 250 pounds. Cremation is like over twice that, is 540 pounds of carbon dioxide. And I'll also, if people are interested, talk a little bit about these 2 other disposition methods that are becoming really popular. It is not legalized in Pennsylvania yet, but these are 2 options that are actually, I believe right now, actually in the state Senate, they're considering a bill on aquamation and alkaline hydrolysis. So that might be coming up in our hopefully near future. But basically, aquamation or alkaline hydrolysis or water cremation, as you may have heard of it, is about 135 pounds of carbon dioxide. And that's partially because in that process, and water cremation is basically like using compounds like lye to like sort of use water to break down a body. And so it's usually still hot water. And that's also partially why it uses that much carbon dioxide. So that's 135 pounds. And then green burial, you're actually sequestering carbon dioxide. And in terms of natural organic reduction, which you may have heard of also as known as body composting, that's like negative like 3,000. So that's definitely considered the greenest option. And just for reference, per year, Americans typically consume about 16 tons of carbon dioxide. So I don't know if that is helpful for anyone in terms of just like getting a sense of how much these are compared to each other. So this next slide, I have just a listing of all of the green burial options in Pennsylvania ranked by price. So this is just to give you a sense of how much a green burial costs relative to like compared to a traditional burial, basically. And this is just the price. The prices listed here are just the prices of the actual plot and interment. So it doesn't include, for example, the price of like a funeral service or anything that's provided by a funeral home. This is just what's provided by the cemetery. And I'm not familiar enough with like the geography of Pennsylvania to know exactly which of these might be closest to you all. But the only non-hybrid, and like I mentioned at the beginning, hybrid is basically when you have a traditional cemetery that has decided to allow for a green burial option within their cemetery, but they offer both. The only non-hybrid green burial option in Pennsylvania is Penn Forest, which is out by basically by Pittsburgh, and they're 100% national burial park, and they're a conservation forest, which means that they are also using that their mission is to sort of like use that to preserve the land that they're sitting on.
Isabel, can I just throw something in real quick?
Yeah, please.
Long story, we don't need to go into it, but several years ago, my mother and I got two burial plots at West Laurel Hill in the Nature Sanctuary section. And I know now they're up to about 15,000 for the two of them. And when I bought the two plots at Fountain Hill, which geographically, besides I didn't know about the Upper Darby one, is geographically, besides Upper Darby, the closest to us, it was like $3,000 for two plots. So,
yeah, if you could send me that information, then I can put that in here.
Sure.
That'd be great. Yeah, so it really varies. I believe the one in Upper Darby, the Southwest Burial Ground, is like a Quaker, is run by Quakers. Yeah, this is, I think I requested this from them recently. All the things that have links in here, and I'm going to send this out after the presentation, are the cemeteries that actually list their prices online. For everyone else, I had to just send them an email and ask them for a price list. And just as a note, because I also do work with the Funeral Consumers Alliance, and this is like what we do, pricing around both funerals and, you know, cemeteries is often very opaque and very difficult to find online. Often you just have to call, and I've even had some cases where people have asked me to like literally come and like drive to their location, which I believe is illegal. Like they're required to give you at least prices on the phone or to email it to you. But that is one of the things that the Funeral Consumers Alliance does, is like literally we just call funeral homes and like ask them for their prices, pretending like we're consumers, and list their prices on our website so that people can access some of that price transparency. So just FYI for anyone who's interested in doing some pre-planning and going through the frustrating work with trying to find prices. So that is basically the rundown around green burial. And I would love to talk a little bit just about alkaline hydrolysis, because this is something that is being considered right now. But basically, just to give you all a sense of what this is, it is essentially using this hot water and lye to sort of liquefy the organic tissue, and it actually does produce ashes. And for those of you who aren't familiar, when you're in the traditional cremation process, what the ashes themselves actually are is just, and when you cremate someone, the bones are left over and they'll go into a machine known as a cremulator that will basically grind the bones into a powder known as cremains or ashes. And so that's the reason why both of these processes can produce ashes, is because it's basically just like sort of ground up bone. So that is something that I believe is available for pets if you want your pet to have a water cremation or aquamation, but is not currently legal for humans. So that's something that's on the horizon. And then in terms of this natural organic reduction process or body composting, this is probably the one that people are least familiar with, because this is the most sort of cutting edge technology. This is something that was only really the woman who came up with natural organic reduction, her name is Katrina Spade, and she's based in Washington State. So she has a company called Recompose that basically was like the first main company to do body composting. And so that was the first place it was legalized in Washington State. And now it's become legal in both Oregon and Colorado. And I believe New York State is also has a bill that is being proposed to try to legalize natural organic production there. But essentially what it is composting, very similar to the concept of composting like in your backyard. The goal of it is, instead of having the whole, you know, decomposition process take 2 years, it tries to speed that process up to 4 to 6 weeks. And partially that is to, especially in more urban areas, allow you to literally like process more people quicker, because one of the things that people in death care sort of worry about is that right now the way it stands, there is not enough infrastructure that is going to be available to really deal with the amount of demand that's going to be required in sort of like the 2020s and 2030s, basically. So based on like the demographics of this country, we need to build a lot more infrastructure to get people, to have enough death care facilities that are adequate for everyone who's going to need them. So that's partially why, these new alternative disposition methods are coming about, as well as, to be more environmentally friendly. So at the end of that process, instead of getting ashes, you actually get a cubic yard of soil, and you can choose to take that soil and go plant a tree with it in your own backyard, or you can choose to donate that soil to like a conservation forest like Penn Park. And just in case any of you have heard of this before, this is the much preferred method of trying to sort of go back to nature. There's been some other initiatives that I would consider to be basically greenwashing. Like you might have heard of memorial parks, for example, which is basically where you have a park and people will charge to have you scatter your ashes there. It turns out that, and they'll often market this as like, another sort of like going back to nature, like this is the environmentally friendly thing to do. It turns out that ashes are actually pretty bad for trees and growing things, because the pH of ashes is very high. And so often, especially if you do it in a really concentrated, like if you just dump it all in one area, like all of the plants are going to die. So if you've heard of these, like this is something that has become, I think, more trendy in the last couple of years. I really don't recommend them, especially because even if you really do want to scatter ashes, you can basically do that anywhere for free. So it's a little bit of a racket. So just like to make you guys aware of some of those sort of less recommended options. Those are definitely some things that market themselves as being like environmentally friendly when they're actually not. So yeah, I'm just going to pause there. That was about half an hour, and just see if people have any questions. I have a lot more things that are like, that I can talk about if people are interested, things like body donation and things like that in this presentation. But would love to hear if anyone has any questions so far.
Talk.
Hello. Yes, I was wondering, how do the bones decompose in the soil to become soil in 6 weeks?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of what they do, and to answer your question, I don't 100% know. I actually sent them an email because I got this question before, and to ask them that, but the Recompose company has not gotten back to me. But I can tell you what I do know, which is that the way that process works, if you're familiar at all with like traditional plant composting, you basically add bacteria to a mixture of like mulch and like greens and browns, basically like the thing that you're composting, and like things like grass clippings and stuff like that. And what that will do is it actually gets very hot. Your like traditional compost pile, I don't remember the exact temperature, but we'll basically like that whole process generates a lot of heat. And so that is basically the method is essentially like they just add a bunch of bacteria, and they do that for livestock basically on farms as well. But they might just take the bones out for all I know. Like someone asked me that also for things like pacemakers and like prosthetics and stuff like that, like what they do with those. And I'm not really sure exactly what they do.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I believe they take the pacemakers out, because there's also, and I was in cardiology, and there's stuff in there, but not as much with prosthetics. And I believe it is bacteria when I looked into it. The other issue with aquamation is that I think it's legal now in something like 21 states.
Yeah.
but the actual machine that they use is really expensive. So in a lot of those states that it's legal, there still isn't an actual physical place
Yeah.
that they can take it. And yes, it is. I actually sent letters to my state senator and House of Representatives asking for them to approve the aquamation, but it doesn't mean that we're instantly going to be able to do that. And Isabel, feel free to use this. I heard the comparison of cremation to aquamation is in cremation, you're putting your mother in the fire. In aquamation, you're putting her in a nice warm bath.
Yeah.
I have a question. It's very basic about the time frame involved. I mean, if we're not using any sort of embalming, is there a time limitation that you've got to get the body from, from the point of death to this facility quickly? Or, if it's summertime,
Yeah.
things could really go bad on you.
That's a great question. So this is actually very pertinent to my home funeral stuff. So basically, if you like, regardless of whether it's summer or winter, you don't have to embalm. You can use dry ice, basically, as long as the three main ways that you can sort of preserve someone after death is basically you can embalm them, you can put them on dry ice, or you can refrigerate them. And so typically, if you're for home funeral people who like don't want to use a funeral home or like anything like that, they literally just go out and buy some ice packs. And that will, so legally by state, and this is something that if you were interested in other states, you can find a list of the different regulations by state on the National Home Funeral Alliance website. And I can link that if people are interested. But basically, other states do have basically a period of time, like you have to cremate or you have to embalm within like 24 or 36 hours. Pennsylvania does not. So you can, I mean, it's not recommended to like keep someone on dry ice for like a super long time. Usually it's about like 3 to 4 days max. You can't do it for like a week, but that is basically what you would do in the interim period between like the time of death and actually interring the body.
Well, a follow-up and leading into the question of home funeral, and that is that legal in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, that's legal in every state.
Okay.
Everyone, and that's something that people don't know, which is why
Yeah.
like it's something that we try to do a lot of education about. Every person is entitled to bring someone home, like whether it's from the hospital or if someone died at home, like you are not obligated at all to use a funeral home in any circumstance, basically. Like something that that is basically everyone's right. Something that people are, I think, becoming more aware of is so one of the things the Home Funeral Alliance is trying to do is create like community care groups where instead of going to a funeral director, it's like just trying to educate the community in like a very like mutual aid kind of way of how to do things like help someone shroud. And like there are various religious communities that do this, like, the Jewish tradition has these things called Heber Kadisha, which is literally like these volunteer groups of people who are specifically called on to, like when someone dies, they call the rabbi and the rabbi like sort of sends in all these volunteers who will come and like help you to wash the body and shroud the body and like sit shiva and like all those things that they do ritualistically. So like when I first heard about this, I was like, oh my God, we should totally have that exact same thing, like for in like a secular context or like, for everyone. And so that is something that especially if you are interested in starting something like that, is super needed, I think, in terms of just like, that is sort of the way traditionally, like for millennia before the funeral, industrial complex, basically, people were doing it, right? And a lot of that knowledge is sort of like has been lost, or people have sort of been convinced by a lot of these funeral directors and funeral homes that like this is a very like medicalized process, you need professionals to do it, and that's most of the time really not the case, right? Like most people can, wash and shroud a body themselves. And in fact, find that really, really meaningful to do that yourself, right? That can be a really big part of the grieving process, is feeling as if you have like, so often, in that period, people feel very helpless, like they don't know what they can do. And it like kind of gives people a thing to do, right? And that can be really cathartic for people to help them like process the trauma of watching a loved one die. So, yeah.
Back to the term of home funeral, that is in no way has anything to do with being able to be buried in my own garden in my backyard.
I mean, often people, it doesn't have to, basically. I mean, often they go hand in hand because, often there's a lot of overlap between the type of people who want green burial and the type of people who want a home funeral. But you can do you can very much go the traditional route with a funeral home, as long as you ask them not to embalm, and, have them use a green burial ground or green cemetery.
But not my backyard.
Oh, sorry. In the case of if you want to like bury someone in your backyard, you basically just have to like list that someone is buried there, like on the deed, essentially. So that is legal in Pennsylvania. I believe though, like, and I think that this is super rare, like technically if you sell your land and it's listed that there's someone buried there, they can like, I don't know, if they're like uncomfortable with it or something for whatever reason, I believe they can ask you to like disinter the body when you like sell the property. But I've never heard of that actually happening. So that's just like one of the risks though, of just doing it on your own land.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. I was led to believe, like, if you have a viewing,
Mhm.
I was told by the funeral director that the person has to be embalmed.
Right. So that is not law. That funeral homes but might have that as like their own policy. A lot of funeral directors like to say, oh, legally we're required to embalm, but like that is absolutely not the case. That is in fact the one regulation in this space is called the funeral rule. The funeral homes are all regulated by the FTC, and the funeral rule specifically states that on all of their general price list, they have to say that you are not required to like purchase any services that you don't want to, and that includes embalming.
Oh, I thought it was a health and safety thing. So
No.
like, if you're gonna leave a body for people to walk around and look at, had to be embalmed. So you're saying, no, that's not a necessity.
But
So-
they can say like, our funeral home isn't gonna do that based on our own policies. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Yeah. But legally, like they're not legally required to do that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
What if the person who has passed away had COVID or some other communicable disease? How does that impact any type of burial, but particularly a green burial?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, I believe the Green Burial Council has an entire article on green burial and COVID specifically. And I can try to find that before we end and just like link it for you all. But basically the summary is just that you can really only catch COVID from someone who's breathing, so a living person. That was something they were worried about like at the beginning of the pandemic when they hadn't figured that out yet, basically. But sorry, was that the question? Let me just make sure I'm answering the right question. I will say a lot of the body donation places were not taking people who had died of COVID. And so those people all had to sort of like find a plan B. But in terms of like the actual burial, I don't think it changes any of the burial related things. Is that what you were asking? Okay. You're on mute.
So you're not contagious of a communicable disease.
Yeah. In terms of like, yeah, the only, I think there are like that. I think it's definitely not true for COVID. I believe there are like really rare edge cases that applies to next to no one, where you have to worry about communicable diseases after someone has died. That's all listed on the Green Burial Council website as well. So let me at least just link the general Green Burial Council page, because they're super thorough, and they have a lot of like scientists and stuff who contribute to their website. So I just put the link to that in the chat, just so people, I mean, they have like really comprehensive FAQs that talk about a lot of that stuff.
And I just actually was reading an article on this. Ebola is really the only one
That's the one, yeah.
that
I remember
you
what it was.
that the body still has a possible contagion. Everything else, viruses need to have a living host in order to replicate. So once that person has died, the virus has lost its ability to replicate from that body. So bodies are not contagious. Again, it's with that one exception of Ebola, and with what Scott was saying, that's part of how the funeral industry has made their money, is by convincing everybody that the body is going to be horribly contagious to everybody, and it's going to be breaking down by the time you have your viewing, when it can simply be refrigerated and not embalmed.
And
Sorry,
what about
sorry, Isabel, I just read something.
No worries. Thank you. Please jump in, and not just Lori. Like, if anyone knows anything about these things, please jump in.
And what about odors? So, you haven't yet really talked about home burial, but when the body is no longer under ice and it's beginning to decompose, what kind of odors will there be?
Yeah, so typically that, unless you typically that doesn't happen until basically long past the time you would have buried somebody. So that's why people typically advise to bury within like at least 3 or 4 days. But that goes back to the kind of the depth that I was talking about at the beginning. So the smell barrier, I believe, is about like, I want to say 6 inches. That's something that's also listed on the Green Burial website. And they basically talk about how the odors that are released, especially if you are doing it properly, where you like allow there to be proper oxygen flow, is actually like, so you can't smell it, the animals can't smell it. That's what and if you're really interested in reading more about this, there's like a very long article that I can send on the science. I can also post that in the chat here. But yeah, basically, if you're burying at the right depth, there should not be any odors that are released once someone has been buried. Okay, so I was wrong. It's not 6 inches, it's 18 to 24 inches. And that's listed in that article that I just posted.
So can I ask you for a typical scenario?
Mhm.
So you die, you want to have a green burial. I'm
Yeah.
not so sure my family's going to want to bathe my body. So is there a way, what would happen? You'd say, number one, would the standard funeral homes work with you on this, or do you have to find a special one? And then the second question is, so you die, can they take you and like bury you, and then you can have a memorial service or whatever without having a shrouded body or something like that?
Yeah, you could basically, in this case, have a memorial service before or after, like whenever you want, right? Because, I mean, if you want, often, well, not often, but especially for people who are doing home funerals, they will have people come just do a viewing with a person on ice, basically. And so you know, if you want to do that, you can still have some component of like having a viewing if you can sort of like get people there quickly.
Let's say you don't want to. Let's just say,
Yeah.
you know, so what do you say to the home? Just like take the body, shroud it and bury it in a green burial place?
Yeah, so basically there are definitely funeral homes that will work with you. You do have I would not say that's true across the board. So you do have to do a little bit of upfront prep to like call ahead and see if this is something that they will help you with. I know for at least like, you know, Lori, you mentioned West Laurel Hill. I know that people at West Laurel Hill will help you with that, like on any level. Like they will help you if you want to do basically a full home funeral and that you just need them to help you fill out like the death certificate and stuff like that. They can help you with that, or, you know, they can help basically be as hands-on as you want them to be. But that does definitely vary by funeral home. And I would love to, like one of the projects I would love to work on is like starting to put together a list of which funeral homes are more like home funeral friendly and will help you do that kind of thing, as opposed to like the ones that just want you to have their standard package or whatever. Does that answer your question?
Kinda. It's just that you know, what if you want a green burial without the home funeral? That, I guess that's kind of where I'm going.
Oh yeah, so literally the funeral home itself doesn't like they coordinate with whatever cemetery you want.
Okay.
So they, you know, yeah, you could just say this is the cemetery that I am using, and they transport your body there.
Then, and they do that, all that, I mean, you can do a memorial however you want to do it, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. But that's like across the board, regardless of whether you're doing green burial or a traditional cemetery. It's like sometimes they have, if you don't already have a cemetery that you're looking to use, like they might say, oh, this is the one that we refer people to or whatever, and this is the one we typically work with. But you're always welcome to just say this is the
Okay, so if you
people
want to do a
have all over
green,
the place, right?
if you want to do a green burial, you really have to talk to your funeral service, funeral home ahead of time to make sure they're going to be dispose of you, you know, as expeditiously as possible. And then you would look into, you know, the memorial part of it, I'm assuming.
Yeah, the thing that the funeral homes are less likely to help you with is the home funeral aspect of it. But if you're not worried about the home funeral stuff, you just want to do green burial, almost all of the funeral homes will help you do that. You should
Okay.
you should call ahead anyway. You know, I think you should always call ahead and just like
Yeah.
confirm your plans that are going to work out the way you want them to. But I think most funeral homes are going to, I mean, because it's not really that different. It's just where are they taking the body? And often it's literally easier to do a green burial than a traditional burial, right? Because like there's less of that work that needs to be done in terms of embalming and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
If there is no green burial place close at hand, what do people do other than give up?
That's a great question. One thing you can do other than give up is encourage cemeteries near you to open a green burial section. This is one thing that like if people are wondering what to do about environmental advocacy, this is a great place that people don't think about, right? And that's actually one of the things that this organization that I mentioned, Friends of Green Burial PA, one of the main things that they do outside of just green burial education is basically approaching cemeteries and saying, hey, like, just look at the numbers. People are burying less and cremating more. You guys are going out of business. People are really concerned about the environment right now. Like, it seems like it would be a great, you know, step for you guys to take, even just business wise, to open a green section in your cemetery. So that's one thing that I encourage everyone to do if this is something that you find, you know, impactful, is try to, there's so many cemeteries in this state and only like, you know, you saw the list, like, you know, 10 or 16 of them are green. So, or have green sections available. So that is one thing that I would recommend people do if you have relationships with cemeteries near you, or you've already bought a plot somewhere, but you want to like say, hey, like, I would like this to be an option for people in the future. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have a quick story. So way back in about the 50s, they were selling cemetery plots. And some of my folks had a cemetery plot. I had both my folks cremated. So when the second folk died, dad sat on mom's, like coffee table for a long time. But when she died, it was like, okay, we'll use one of these cemetery plots. Well, they were a total ripoff because to open, it's like, well, we have to open it up. We have to do this. We have to do that kind of thing, just to put 2 urns in. All right. My question is, but the nice thing about cremation is you don't have to really deal with cemeteries right away. I mean, technically, you're not allowed to just spread the ashes, but everybody does anyway. But the question is if you go green burial, they're going to hit you with all these ridiculous fees. And, like, is it going to be like that? It was a total ripoff, in my opinion, with what the cemetery was doing. So, now you got to get involved with a cemetery. Is there going to be all sorts of, well, we got to open up the cemetery and then we have to do this and then we have to do that,
Totally.
that kind of thing.
I mean, part of the reason the Funeral Consumers Alliance exists is because so much of what is going on in the industry is a racket, right? Like it is just, we have seen, I mean, the last time I was doing price lists, like it is totally bananas, the range and like the disparity between like the cheapest cremation and the most expensive cremation. And like, that's true across the board for all of these services, right? And like, hypothetically speaking, this should be a commodity, right? Like, it's pretty much the same experience, you're getting the same thing, right? So why should one cost $900 and one of them costs $9,000, right?
Yeah, no, and they nickel and dime you. They really do, the cemeteries. I mean,
The cemeteries and the funeral homes, like I've seen so many funeral homes that are like, oh, you would never spend only $4,000 on a casket for your poor mother. I'm sure you loved her, right? And there's definitely, I mean, not to say that all of the cemeteries and all the funeral homes do this, but there's definitely an element of that emotional exploitation of, let's use money as a proxy.
And what I saw with my folks was in the funeral home itself. Yeah, there were all these temptations to play on the emotions. What do you want to do to remember mom or dad or whatever? But then when you got to the cemetery, there were all these specific mechanical things that you had to address,
Right.
And again, there were all these nickel and dime fees just to open up the ground, put somebody in the ground, close up the ground, if you follow what I mean. That wasn't so much of an emotional game as the one in the home. It was more. So I guess what I'm saying is if you get a cemetery involved with a green burial, are we going to have similar issues like that? Like the mechanical stuff? Like,
Yeah.
it's going to cost so much to open up that plot of land.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I've seen, most of the like extra fees and stuff that you see are things like, for example, like people don't know that there's a vault. So they're like, what is this that you're charging me for? And things like that. Generally, what you should be paying for with a green burial is basically like the opening and closing.
Right.
Right. You definitely need someone to do that unless you want to go
Right.
dig yourself. And, the actual plot, basically.
Yeah.
And
but they're not going to nickel and dime you as much. I guess that's really what my question is.
Well, I can't guarantee
You don't
that.
know. Okay.
A lot of these cemeteries are like basically just traditional cemeteries that are like are hybrids basically that are opening a green section.
Yeah.
But so basically like that is sort of like the case for pre-planning and just calling and making sure you understand what they're going to be charging you for, So that is one thing that I always tell everyone is like, there's literally never too early to pre-plan. I have everything planned out for myself. Like I tell all of my peers that this is something they need to do. Every major milestone, whether it's like you're having a kid or your kid is like aging out, and turns 18, like all of these major life milestones, like when you move are good opportunities to revisit all of your end of life plans, your advanced directives, what have you. So you can never plan too much.
And I always wondered when my in-laws were buried, they were buried in caskets, beautiful, magnificent, very expensive caskets that went into a vault. And I forever, does the funeral home take the beautiful, expensive casket out and reuse it? I always wondered about that.
I don't think they do that. There's definitely always things that I haven't heard of, like as well. Like there's like, you know, all the stuff around like, you know, body donation places that are like not the nonprofits, like for-profit body donation places, like selling body parts and stuff like that. Like, so for all I know, like maybe that I can never say like nothing, you know, for sure, whatever it is doesn't happen. I've never seen that in terms of like people calling to the Funeral Consumers Alliance and complaining about, you know, the behavior of cemeteries or funeral homes and things like that. But as far as I know, that doesn't happen.
I have a question from earlier in your presentation where you said something about shallower burials. And after 2 years, the plot can be reused. And I'm just had a mental picture of a body buried under 3 or 4 feet deep. I guess the backhoe would dig a hole 3 or 4 feet deep and body would go in and then be covered up. And then in 2 years, if the backhoe came to dig the hole again, wouldn't there still be bones left? Do they have to move the bones, or it was kind of, I couldn't figure that out.
Yeah, they might have to clear out some of the bones. I don't believe, that's another thing that I don't 100% know the answer to, like what happens to the bones. But my guess is that if there's still bones there, they'll just sort of like, you know, push them to the side or something. But that's a great question. I will have to ask the next person I talk to who runs one of the green burial grounds, like what they do. Any other questions? Great. Well, in that case, thank you so much, Lori, for inviting me to do this. This has been great. You've been a wonderful crowd with awesome questions. So much for being this participatory.
Oh, I thought she said you had, Isabel, I thought you said you had more slides. Like, I thought this was a break in putting in the questions now and then you were going to do more slides.
I don't have other slides around the green burial stuff. I am happy to talk about like body donation and stuff like that if people are interested in that option. I have slides on like home funerals, what a home funeral guide is, and like what the different planning documents are that you need, like advanced directives, what a post form is, stuff like that. Like what a death doula is. So I'm happy to talk about any of those topics if people are interested in them. But I want to also acknowledge that those are not necessarily green burial topics.
And we could look a lot of them up online too. My mom donated her body, wanted her body donated. And I can't remember the details now, but there was a Philadelphia, it was either Pennsylvania or Philadelphia. There was an organization that handled all such for science to be used in medical school, and we had to set that up ahead of time and call that person when she passed, and they had someone from the medical school, I believe, come and pick up the body at the nursing home, and then a year later or so, I got the ashes.
Yeah.
But that was all online. You just have to type in a body donation and it would come up how to do it in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the one main thing to keep in mind, and I can just go ahead and share those slides since we're talking about it. The group that you're talking about is the Humanity Gifts Registry.
Yes, that was it.
Yeah. And they are basically, so there's basically two groups that are the two nonprofit groups that take whole body donations, and they're the only two groups that we recommend people use, because like I said, there are some like for-profit groups that do, I think, shadier things with the bodies. But so we recommend Humanity Gifts Registry. They're PA only, and they do not take bodies that have done organ donation. So if you have that like organ donor little heart on your driver's license, technically they cannot take those because like they're not whole cadavers basically for their like teaching medical students. What's cool about them is they do have like a little remembrance celebration in Philly and Pittsburgh for all of the donors who donate. And then, like you said, they basically cremate afterwards and then send you the ashes. The other one that we recommend is Anatomy Gifts Registry, and they do take bodies that have donated organs. And they are less like medical schools like Temple and like UPenn. They're more like labs and places that are doing like medical research. So things like the robots that like do surgeries and like training EMTs and things like that. Those are the kinds of things that Anatomy Gifts Registry uses them for. So those are the two groups that we recommend. And like the main thing to remember with any type like, you know, whole body donation is just that you can't just like put it in your will that like, you know, you want someone to donate your body after you die. Like you actually have to go onto the websites of one of these two organizations and fill out their consent form, you know, while you're still alive, basically. And if you don't have that consent form, then they can't take it. And like I said, some of these places have been like putting, I think Humanity Gifts Registry specifically was not taking any like COVID bodies. And I don't know if that's still their policy right now. That's probably something that you could look up on their website. But that was something that was sort of put on hold. So not only plan ahead and make sure you have that consent form filled out, but also make sure you have a plan B in case something like that happens. And, you know, there's some extenuating circumstance that makes you unable to donate your body.
But Mom had a colonoscopy and they took her body anyway. So it was, you know, her innards were altered, so to speak. But probably it's just wise to ask ahead. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Cool. Does anyone have any questions on the donation piece?
And I will say, as far as like the post form that Isabel mentioned, I covered in the advanced directives talk from a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not sure whether he's uploaded it yet, but Scott was supposed to be uploading that so that we have a library of these.
That's great.
And I covered the post, but I didn't cover donation.
Cool.
All righty. Anybody else have any questions? Nope, Elaine's shaking her head.
I have a question. So I'm really excited about burying a body in the backyard. So what should I know about this? It seems like there's probably rules about this, like how deep you should dig and all that kind of stuff. How do I find that out?
Yeah. So basically, I want to say the website that you would need to go to is Pennsylvania. I think it's just like a subset of the Department of Health, but I could be wrong. So let me just give it a quick Google. But basically, the main thing, I mean, first of all, it's not like super enforceable, like it's your property. But basically, in terms of like, there's no law that says that you can't do a home burial. So like, there's nothing that you need to like, yeah, Pennsylvania and anywhere else, like, you know, you should be able to bury at home. And in terms of things like, you know, the depth and stuff like that, I think those, as opposed to being like legal rules, are really just more of a like, this is what you need to do to make sure like you don't smell the body and like it doesn't get dug up by animals and things like that. And all of that stuff is pretty much exactly the same that you would find in, green burial cemetery or natural burial ground. And you can find all of that information. Actually, most of that stuff is actually in that article that I linked on the science of green burial. Is like it gives you those types of specifications. But I mean, you basically need to dig a hole and have it be 3 to 4 feet deep.
3 4 feet. Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right.
Some states where it has to be a certain distance from a body of water, like I think Connecticut and a couple other states have particular regulations around that. And that is in that legal requirements by state page that I linked as well. So it has like distance from water, distance from buildings, etc. And so all of the like home burial stuff, they always say like at the very least call someone to check on like zoning and stuff like that. I don't know the specific person that you call about zoning in Pennsylvania. But yeah, basically the main thing that they say in terms of like green burial for Pennsylvania is that you can't have like water on the property that drains into a municipal water source. So you just have to like I'm sure like you can find that out by looking at like a map of the like different watersheds in your area.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Isabel, would you have a guesstimate as to when there might be some of the places to do the conservation stuff? And I mean, you mentioned the Friends of
Green Burial PA.
Yeah, Green Burial PA, but the doing the body composting, for lack of a better phrase. Any idea where there will be places available, if the legislation has even been put through, and when that might possibly come about?
Yeah, so I'm basically working on trying to get that legalized here. And I've never gone through the process of state level advocacy in that way. So I really don't know how long it takes. Like maybe it takes 5 years, maybe it takes 15 years. I have no idea. So in terms of the legal timeline of like how long it's going to take to get approved, like I have been talking with Chris Rabb, who is a member of the House of Representatives, and he is like happy to propose it, but he was like, oh, any legislation that's proposed by Democrats in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives has like less than a 0.5% chance of passing. It has to basically be proposed by a Republican. But my hope is that, there are Republicans who are going to see this as a like, why is the government limiting people's choice kind of issue, right? And it's also a religious freedoms issue, right? Like there's plenty of people like, the Jewish people and Mennonites, and I'm sure like UUs could also claim like, this is something that we want to be able to do. So anyway, that's something that I'm hoping will get some traction amongst sort of the more conservative House of Representatives and state Senate senators. So
Because apparently Republicans don't die. Is that why they're not putting that kind of legislation through?
I don't know. I would love to see that pass. So like one thing that I would love to be able to do, if you all are open to it, is like, Lori, you mentioned writing in support of the alkaline hydrolysis bill. Like when a natural organic reduction bill does come up, I would love to be able to like email some sample text, and if anyone is interested in like writing into their state senator or state House of Representatives representative, that would be awesome to be able to get more people on board with just communicating our interest and having that become a law.
If you send it to me when that comes about, and obviously we're going to be talking. And
right.
So did you sign up for the West Laurel tour?
Yeah,
Yeah, I did too. So I'll see you there.
Yeah, for sure.
I can disseminate from there. And actually, I probably should have already disseminated when I sent in because I think I got the acclimation forms and basic test from Compassion and Care or Compassion and Choices.
Yeah.
And then they had a state thing, and then I sent it in from there with the request.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing that.
All righty. Well, unless anybody has any other questions, we'll let Isabel go, and thank you very much. And obviously we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
All righty. Thanks a lot. Glad you all
Thank you
came.
very much.
Nope, and let's
Thank you.
stop recording. There we go.